Hello again, and we're going to talk a little bit right now about Chapter 5 of Siegel's textbook, Criminology, the idea of trait theories. Traits are things that we all have, and this particular discussion here is the first part of the chapter related to biological traits and biological approaches to crime. And so this is going to be a bit different than rational choice theories that we just looked at in the previous slides. The idea here is that criminals become criminals, they do crime, because of something biological or physiologically different about them. And that is something that's within the body of the criminal. All right. So this is not saying that it's rational choice, really, that it's more about something like genetic, biological things that exist inside a person and that then affect them and cause them to some extent to be inclined toward crime. There are early foundations for this type of theory, and you can see that this is going to be, again, on the at the end of the Enlightenment, we have this move toward more science and empiricism, and with that, you see an increase in an emphasis on trying to figure out what is it, what are the characteristics people have that you can empirically map out that might relate to their criminal tendencies. So to begin with, we look at physiognomy. And physiognomy is the study of facial features as a way to infer character or personality. So what you could see is perhaps some indicators in the face, like, for example, beady eyes, large forehead, lack of facial hair on men and facial hair on women. Some of these things were related back to criminal tendencies or some kind of deviance that the person was going to embody. So they used the face as a map, really, for the stuff going on inside the person. The main guy who promoted this was Johann Lavater, and there are the dates of his life. You could see he's coming at the end of the Enlightenment there. And his work is, again, emphasizing these kinds of things. So as I just said a minute ago, beardless men, bearded women, you have to be on the lookout for those types, right? Shifty eyes and weak chins, and these are the bases upon which to infer some type of character flaw, immoral character, okay? That's the face. Phrenology is the study of abnormalities on the skull or bumps that are on the head, and that is a way of inferring character or personality, okay? So again, a phrenologist might feel on your head and say, okay, you've got these particular spots that are indented or prominent. You know, you might be a child molester and a rapist. Okay, next person will feel the bumps on you. You're inclined toward theft, these kinds of things, yeah? And so this was very, very popular, believe it or not, at this particular point. And when Franz Joseph Gall lived there, he was the main proponent of this. And it's a fascinating thing to think about. We kind of laugh at these types of things today, but in fact, they're important precursors to the idea of trying to figure out what types of physical things may be going on within a person who commits crime. When we talk about biological predispositions toward crime and early theorists, we should absolutely mention Cesar Lombroso, who lived here 1835 to 1909. So he was after the Enlightenment, really moving into contemporary times. And Lombroso is sometimes referred to as the father of criminology, one of the main founders. And he's certainly the founder of criminal anthropology. And his background, he was a physician, medical doctor, and he did research where he compared the inmates in an Italian prison to Italian soldiers. And you might say to yourself, well, it's an interesting group to compare, as one is supposed to be not criminal and the other is supposed to be criminally oriented. He performed hundreds of autopsies on these individuals, and he came up with this conclusion that different criminal types could be determined by some specific outward appearing stigmata. Okay, stigmata. What could those things be? Again, kind of like the phrenologists and the physiognomists, these involve body traits. Okay, so something like maybe excessive hair, weak chins, and other physical features that distinguish criminals from non-criminals. His methodology is quite suspect and has been debated quite heavily. Actually, it's been denounced, I should say. And that was because his control group really is not an average control group of people in a society. Soldiers are, in some ways, also very distinct from criminals. But he found some very odd things, including, for example, the idea that criminals might have more tattoos than non-criminals. Now, you might think to yourself, that's a bit odd, because tattoos are not biologically given to us, right? We choose them. But his theory, interestingly enough, said that the type of people who might get tattoos would have, say, for example, a lesser response to pain. And so therefore, that was an indicator inside of a person of their likelihood to not be affected by punishment. He developed this concept of atavistic anomalies, the notion that criminals are really throwbacks to more primitive people. They were less evolved and thus less able to be in contemporary society, less able to control themselves. And that's a useful thing to consider. As I mentioned a second ago, Lombroso's theories were discredited largely because he didn't use control groups from the general population. He used soldiers, and that didn't work as a control. One important policy implication, though, is the idea of eugenics, and that you can define as the science of good breeding or right breeding. Came on the heels of Lombroso's ideas and is a very popular notion, especially in the early 1900s in the United States. Eventually, dozens of states in the US had laws on the books which allowed for the sterilization of what were called feeble-minded persons. And actually, the Nazis got some of their ideas about eugenics types of policies and their policies which would call for euthanasia of the mentally ill and the hereditarily ill. They got those ideas primarily from the United States. Biological-based theories also included those from what's called the inheritance school, which is mentioned in your Siegel book, and it includes people like Goddard, Richard Dugdale, and Easterbrook. And these were theorists looking at families that had criminal histories, and they mention the Jukes in your textbook, and they also mention the Kallikaks, and they did these kind of genetic charts, more like kind of family trees, if you will, which showed the relationship between the parents and maybe some of their criminal backgrounds or antisocial tendencies, and then the children and what they would do. And so you would have these charts which very much showed that families that were good, that had no criminal backgrounds, tended to have more children like that, and then the other families were more prone to delinquency, thus explained through biology, according to this school. So criminal tendencies rooted in genetics. E.A. Houghton is a Harvard anthropologist, and he argued in 1939 that criminality was biological, and he was taking some of the theories of Lombroso and trying to revive some of those. He didn't take all of them, but he did try to, again, revive some, and he said that to some extent, if there is this biological genetic type tendency, then the natural policy implication would be criminals should be isolated physically and sterilized. And that is, of course, a natural, quote-unquote, policy implication that would derive from the fact that if you believe criminals have some biological inferiority, then you wouldn't want those people reproducing. And so what I have here is it's important to think about the policy implications of different types of theories about crime. The policy implications, for example, for choice theories, are radically different than some of the policy implications you might see related to biology being linked to crime. You have very different ideas about what ought to be done about crime, and in some respects, the extent to which the individual should be held accountable. In the previous theory, classical criminology and the choice theories, the notion is that the individual is making the wrong choices. If you're stressing a link between biology and crime, then you have to wonder if the individual is as responsible. You don't choose your biology, and therefore, perhaps things like surgery or medicine should be used to treat those people. We can also discuss William Sheldon's work, and he developed the notion of somatotype theories, an idea of body type being linked to personality. And he came up with 3 different body types, physical types. And what I've done is I've given you the type and then an example at the end of each one. The endomorph is generally, if you want to stereotype this person, the jolly fat man. That's the idea. So characteristics of friendly, social, even-tempered. Actors like John Candy, you might be familiar with. The stereotype again, Santa. Okay. Mesomorphs have a very different physiology. They're assertive, aggressive, energetic, and ambitious, and they're much more muscle-bound as people. And so you see examples like, for example, Bruce Willis, Sylvester Stallone. You could put Mike Tyson in that list. But generally speaking, very muscular and very active. The final body type he came up with, somatotype, I should say, ectomorph. And these are what I think of as sort of the reclusive, poetic, thin guys. And that's exactly how he characterized them. Subdued intellectual types, more sensitive. So that would include poets, writers like Charles Dickens, astronomers like Carl Sagan, for example. And probably no surprise, he found in his study of delinquent males that their body types were decidedly mesomorphic. And this has actually been reproduced in other studies as well. So the background that we just covered in terms of the very, very early phrenology, physiognomy, criminal anthropology through Lombroso, that's really the building block for these modern biological approaches, which is really the greatest concern of Siegel's Chapter 5. And he is focusing on this pretty much because there was a big revival in the early 1970s with this fellow E.O. Wilson publishing a book, Sociobiology, and that's the name of his theory, which brings together findings in biology and the social. And what he wants to do is to try to explain human behavior based on certain ideas. And so his main focus was that people do anything to ensure the survival of their genes. And this is a curious argument because, in fact, we see some evidence that that isn't necessarily true. But there's this idea that people are compelled to pass on their genes and that there's something within us that makes us want to do that. He had to do this fancy footwork, though, in order to make his theory fit some contradictory evidence. One thing that you could question about his theory is the general idea of altruism. What's altruism? If someone's altruistic, that means they come to the aid of others. If you see someone who is begging for money on the street and you give them a $5 bill, that was an altruistic act, right? And it didn't necessarily help you. It was just good for the other person. So in order to make his argument, Wilson had to explain things like altruism. Well, why would somebody voluntarily give up money or help other people? That's not in their interest, in the interest of their survival. he did this fancy move where he said that even coming to the aid of other people is rooted in genetic survival because of what he said was the notion of reciprocal altruism. So what that means is, if I do a good deed for you, then someone else is likely to do a good deed for me. So that's the concept of reciprocal altruism. And he said that even tendencies like this, social tendencies, could be explained through our genes. Questionable, and that is something that has made the theory come under some scrutiny. All right. These modern biological approaches, again, are rooted in the past, and the majority of this chapter focuses on these newer approaches. But I wanted you to have some of that background because you begin to see the importance of the Enlightenment ideas of progress and empirical-based science, all right, and trying to use reason and rationality to understand why criminals act the way that they do. What contemporary theorists do is not so much look at bumps on the head or facial features or things like this that we might find laughable today as indicators of personality, but they focus importantly on tendencies, all right? So tendencies like aggression, violence, and impulsivity, they're not searching for criminal genes. And that's important because crime is socially defined. Every society defines it differently. And therefore, trying to find a gene that every society would say, oh, that's definitely criminal, that's a bit iffy. But you can find biological genetic tendencies, right? That's the idea. The thing about aggression, violence, impulsivity, though, is that they can be related to crime, but not necessarily. The interesting thing, for example, about mesomorphs, the biological ideas that we just talked about a slide or two ago, that's the notion that certain physical types are more aggressive, right? Those physical types may be more inclined toward crime, but they also make for good CEOs, right? Leaders of companies and corporations. And so that's the idea. These traits might incline people toward crime, but they might not. And that's important to remember. Modern research about biological tendencies in crime, or biological links in crime, has an interesting starting point, and it's a useful thing to think about. Sometimes it's a little confusing the way it's written in your text, so I want to clarify it. It's this notion of equipotentiality. All right? The notion is that equipotentiality would be everyone is born equal. In point of fact, people are born with very, very different biological stuff, right? Your brain chemistry might be very different from another person you see today, and you might have a different way of metabolizing than other people. So we're not born with equipotentiality. So we all don't have an equal potential to learn and achieve. And that is an assumption of these biological theories, that biologically we're all different. That's an important assumption because it relates to the root of learning. Learning is controlled by things like biochemistry and cellular interactions. And so therefore, biology is really the root for people's potential to learn and to achieve. And this is important to think about because we're not all born with the same stuff. There are also ways in which your biology, your physiology, can be affected by activities. Okay? So for example, your nutrition, the way in which you keep up with your diet. Your text mentions that there are minimum levels of vitamins and minerals that are necessary for normal brain functioning. If people are deprived of those, then you might see very strongly certain kinds of physical and behavioral problems resulting from this. So as an example, people who have certain kinds of vitamin deficiencies. They might have depression. They might have other kind of physiological reactions to this. Nutrition also involves things like sugar, and there's been research on behavior in juveniles that it can be changed by varying the amount of sugar in their diet. Probably no surprise to any of you who have kids, right? The studies, though, they don't just tend to say that an increase in sugar leads to an increase in maybe like hyperactivity. Actually, there are some studies that say that if anything, and your text mentions this, in some cases, sugar might have calmed some children in certain studies, which leads to a very interesting point. The point is that every person has this biology, and then they might eat a food or take a drug, and the drug might have some kind of effect on that person. But then there's also the setting, okay? So there are three things usually if you're talking about a drug interaction. We'll talk about more in a minute. There's the drug, whatever the drug is. There's the mindset of the person, the biology of the person, and then the setting. So as an example, if someone smokes cigarettes, they physiologically might have a general kind of reaction that most people have. However, some of that could involve how they think about the drug. And in this instance, maybe some people smoke to calm down. Maybe some people smoke to get a lift. And so that is different depending on the person. And then finally, the setting itself might affect the way in which a drug or something like sugar affects the body. So if kids are induced toward play activities after eating sugar, then lo and behold, that might affect how they act. Last thing here, we talk about hypoglycemia, and that's this notion that glucose in the bloodstream falls below levels that are needed for normal, efficient brain functioning. And that certainly can affect someone. It can cause depression, for example, and it can cause irritation, maybe impulsiveness too. Hormones have also been seen to play a role in crime, and the study of hormonal influences, hormonal imbalances, has been a topic of research. James Wilson, who was a very famous American criminologist, he argued that the aging out process, which you can see very clearly in men, remember the idea we talked about before, crime is a young man's game, that you can see the idea of crime dropping as the population ages, all right? He believed that the intervening variable with that was testosterone levels, that male testosterone drops significantly after the teenage years and the early 20s. And so he felt that testosterone was what was really, in some ways, behind aging out. Interesting link between some of these earlier points we discussed. There's also discussion in your text here about androgens. And testosterone is an androgen. Okay, so I'd like you to know that. If you have prenatal exposure to unnaturally high levels of testosterone, then that can be linked to aggressive behavior. So something that has been shown in research, and again, that's not a genetic thing, that's an environmental influence that could influence a child who's being born. Right? Hormone levels can influence violent behaviors as well, because they affect things like the brain becoming less sensitive. Here's the less sensitive. The brain becoming less sensitive to environmental stimuli. And that's important because some people might be led to seek some type of excess stimulation, thrill seeking. So the logic here is that if, for example, somebody has a very high level of testosterone, then they're going to be less sensitive, right? And they might be inclined toward doing things that charge them up in a way that might be seen as antisocial by other people. There's also a curious other connection here, which is that if somebody has high levels of testosterone, and they are less sensitive to environmental stimuli. A policy implication for treating these kinds of criminals is perhaps adjusting that, because if they have high level of testosterone, then punishment may not be as effective for them. That might actually be something they perhaps even desire. So the hormone balance levels are something that a lot of researchers have been concerned with. There's also research by Diana Fishbein, and her focus has been female aggression and its link to premenstrual syndrome, PMS. What has been found in her research here is that there are a significant number of incarcerated women who committed their crimes during their premenstrual phase. Now, one thing that your text mentions, which is an important question, is question of cause. Is it that the premenstrual phase caused this kind of aggression or violent antisocial tendency, or did the antisocial tendency, maybe in some of those things, bring on the PMS? So there's a question as to the cause about this. Do you happen to have an allergy? I do. I'm allergic to cats and dogs, pretty much anything with hair. And it's caused me a lot of problems in the past. I've had difficulty being around animals, swelling of the eyes, throat. Sometimes I get to wheeze. And so this is something that you can, I think many people, can really understand some type of unusual or excessive reaction to some kind of foreign substance. Some people are allergic to nuts. Some people are allergic to bees. Some people are allergic to pollen, and you can see some of that in Nebraska at certain times of year when there are a disproportionate number of people who seem to have sinus issues. But allergies are not just simply minor irritants for people. They can lead to a number of different problems, things like depression, aggressiveness, and even violence in people, as well as some kind of hyper-emotional type of reaction. And there's a fascinating study in your text which notes that you can see some kind of link, or at least one study did. It says a study that linked the average consumption of a cerebral allergen, corn, to cross-national homicide rates. You might think to yourself, well, that's kind of crazy. They're linking corn to homicide rates. But imagine if, in fact, they found something. Because now we genetically modify things like corn. If there was this kind of link, perhaps then the policy implication might be changing some type of genetics within a corn product. And that would be a fascinating way to reduce this great problem of homicide. Right? That's a cerebral allergen that they talk about, corn perhaps affecting the brain. And you could also discuss or think about the idea of neuroallergies. Those are affecting the nervous system. Toxins have also been looked at in criminological research, and in particular, there's studies by Deborah Deno who have looked at lead poisoning in kids, and in particular, she's looked at lead poisoning in African American children. How is it that most kids get lead poisoning? One of the central sources for it with children and African American children is lead-based paint. Children in some homes where that paint starts to chip, maybe on a windowsill, might ingest that paint. So what is fascinating is in Deno's study, you have a link between, for example, race and crime that might seem to be perhaps a question of cause, but then she finds another variable which is related to biology and environmental issues, and that biology, that biological effect, might be related to poverty, the fact that poor areas might have this lead-based paint. So trying to find cause is a very, very tricky thing within the field of criminology. But toxins like lead can very much affect people. We can talk also about neurophysiological conditions in crime, and one that they mention in your text, this idea of MBD, minimal brain dysfunction, which is some type of abnormality in the brain structure. And most seriously, it's been linked to very serious antisocial acts and imbalances in the urge control mechanism of the brain, right? So your ability to deal with impulses, that's important, right? And that is something that could very obviously be related to crime, as well as chemical abnormalities in the brain. And so things like, for example, the amount of serotonin that your brain produces can be linked to many types of things like impulsivity and depression. Learning disabilities are also something that researchers in criminology have focused on. And your textbook mentions one particular study in Israel, which is linked to this possible cause for crime. And in the study, 70% of the inmates had learning disabilities. And that is compared to the general population, where you find only 10 to 15% of the general population having such learning disabilities. Now, what again might be the policy implications of this? You can think about if someone is learning disabled, then they might experience a great deal of frustration in trying to catch up with maybe some of their peers. Remember we talked about equipotentiality, the fact that people do not have equal levels of ability, and that that's rooted in biology. So if you're in a classroom with a bunch of other kids and the norm basically is a certain level of learning, then that's going to be very frustrating for you. And perhaps you're going to look for alternative ways of feeling good about yourself. Also, too, perhaps maybe the legitimate ways toward social approval are not so much open to you, like a good career or stable relationships. So learning disabilities, you could think of what are the policy implications of this. It might well be that to some extent we ought to start maybe in very, very early days of school and work very hard with those kids in order to avoid crime, to help them avoid crime. That also relates to ADHD. It's often the acronym used, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. And this is something which has gotten a lot of attention in the last several years. The idea with this is that the person has problems with focus and things like finishing projects, being distracted, and the idea that such individuals might require constant supervision in order to just fulfill everyday kinds of tasks. So this relates again back to something like impulsivity. And again, this isn't, a genetic trait or biological characteristic that necessarily leads to crime. But you can see how some of that type of thing might in fact play into why some people end up doing antisocial things. And several studies these days, as I'm marking here, now link ADHD to the onset and sustenance of a criminal career. There's also been a controversy about this, though, in terms of how do we treat things like hyperactivity disorder with kids. And one of the main ways we do these days is through medication like Ritalin. And some people call this the medicalization of deviance, which means that we treat social problems as if they are medical problems, and we focus really on the individual as the source of those problems. Now, you might say to yourself, well, what's wrong with that? If there's an individual who seems to be hyper, have problems paying attention, doesn't that person need treatment? And it's not necessarily, how can I say this? The logic of why that person is how they are isn't necessarily always rooted in biology. So there's an emphasis on biology at the expense of more social explanations. I'll give you an example. If somebody's very, very depressed because of the job that they have, and they go to see a psychologist, actually it would be a psychiatrist who would be able to give that person medication, right? The person takes the medication and then can deal with their job, but in fact, really the source of the depression isn't something within the individual, it's the environment, right? The key way to reduce that depression would be for that person to lose that job, quit. So in some instances, there seems to have been a rise in the diagnosis of ADHD, but that has corresponded with some other social changes, like, for example, a diminishment in the use of things like recess for kids, and PE, physical education, has been cut back in a lot of schools. So is there a potential link there between the activities that kids are doing and the way that they seem to be unable to control themselves? Perhaps. It's hard to say. Another topic that they talk about here in the text, neurological abnormalities. In this instance, they use the case of a brain tumor and the instance where Charles Whitman, who is a descendant of Walt Whitman, Charles Whitman was, I believe, a Marine. He was well trained in how to use a gun, and he had for quite a long time been starting to experience these very aggressive, violent urges. And he went to see a psychiatrist about these things, and he spoke to this person saying, I'm having these impulses, I can't control them, I don't know why. He ended up going to a bell tower in Texas at a university and shooting a number of people and killing them before he himself was killed. In his will, he left money to be directed toward finding help for people who were experiencing these kinds of problems. And they did an autopsy of Whitman. They found that, in fact, he had a brain tumor, which may have led to his impulsivity and violence. So, a fascinating instance where this individual knew that something was changing within him and couldn't stop it. That leads to a discussion of brain chemistry and the idea that we are, again, not born with equipotentiality. Some people have higher levels of serotonin than others. And serotonin has been linked to depression. It's been linked to impulsiveness. And studies of habitually violent criminals in Finland found that they had lower levels of serotonin. So again, perhaps another policy implication of this would be, should those individuals be given drugs? And you end up with some fascinating questions like, well, could the state make it mandatory for people to take such medication? And probably in the US, no. But the question is, what lies behind some of these criminal tendencies? A fellow named Jack Katz is also responsible for another theory that can relate to biology and crime, and this idea of arousal, what causes people to feel good or alive, to get excited, right? And Jack Katz argues that crime is attractive for some people because it has certain kinds of effects on them. For example, crime can be very thrilling, depending on what type of crime it is. But people will often talk about a rush. They'll feel like they're high, these kinds of things. Just from the act of committing something, adrenaline will really start pumping, and that can feel quite good for some people. So crime can be a source of maximum pleasure for some through excitement. And finally, it can be a way to demonstrate competence for others. So if perhaps somebody is not able to pay attention in a classroom, they might not get very good grades and might be doing poorly in school, but perhaps they can hotwire cars, and that gets them some street credibility, right? Because they have an ability that somebody else maybe doesn't, and it allows them some status. So this is a useful theory to think about when explaining crime, because it says that people have various responses to environmental stimuli. And that response they have can be related to their biology. Some people need very little stimulation in order to feel good or to feel excited. Others, on the other hand, may need quite a bit more. So again, if we're talking about policy implications, if somebody needs a lot to generate arousal, perhaps that's something, again, that could be treated through medication, or perhaps other things like, techniques such as even meditation might help someone to feel calmer and more even. And that, again, might play into crime and why crime happens and what ought to be done about crime. The last few things related to biology and crime in this chapter, we'll talk about genetics and crime, and I would like to focus in particular on two types of research. One of them regards twins, and the other one in the following slide is going to talk about adoption studies. So first, it's important to note the difference between what are called monozygotic, or MZ, twins, which are identical twins, and dizygotic, or what are commonly referred to as fraternal twins. And I'm going to do a drawing here at the bottom in order to illustrate this. If we're talking about monozygotic twins, then you've got an egg that has been inseminated by a sperm there, and that egg has divided in half. So that is the monozygotic, right? That is the identical type of twin. You can also have an instance where you will have two cells in a womb that are inseminated by two sperm, and they are in the womb at the same time. That is the dizygotic, okay? So maybe a little drawing to help illustrate this. Studies about twins have demonstrated that twins, generally speaking, have similar patterns of criminality. So this is a useful thing to think about when you're talking about biology and crime. The assumption would be that twins would have more similar patterns of crime if there is some type of biological or genetic component to crime. The second big important point here is that the tendency, the criminal tendencies, is stronger for identical than for fraternal twins. And again, that supports a genes crime link. You would expect that the tendency would be stronger for twins that have more shared genetic stuff than for those who have two separate eggs with two separate sperm and are inseminated who happen to just share the same womb. Those are fraternal, right? There is a problem or a critique of twin studies, though, and maybe you are familiar with some of this yourself. You might have known some twins, some identical twins, and they might have even been given very similar names by their parents, like Johnny and Jimmy, right? And they look very much alike, and the issue becomes their environment. They are not treated all that differently. They grow up in a very similar environment, and in fact, people might confuse them for each other. So the issue is it biology that's the determinant of the behavior, or is it environment? And that is captured in this idea here. Are twins more likely to be raised in similar ways than non-twins? And if that's the case, then it's not necessarily clear if it's a biological effect or a social environmental effect. So socialization and the fact that some twins particularly have very, very similar socialization might be perhaps the variable instead of inheritance. It's hard to tease out. Finally, under biological-based theories of crime, we can talk about another type of research besides twin studies, and that is adopted children studies. And a key idea with those, that if you have a child that's adopted, it's been adopted, that their criminality is going to be more like their biological parent than like their adoptive parent, okay? And in this case, they often focus on the fathers, right, of the child. And in fact, the research seems to bear this out, that children who are adopted are more like their biological father in terms of criminal patterns than their adoptive father. And according to Sardnoff-Mendick's research from 1984, the pattern seems strongest among chronic offenders rather than occasional offenders. So there's some support for this theory.